Welcome to a Modern Nonprofit podcast, powered by the Charity CFO, your compass for creative solutions in running your nonprofit. I'm Tosha Anderson, your host and guide through this nonprofit maze. From fundraising to volunteer management, we've got your back. Join us each episode for fresh, game-changing strategies that can make a real impact. Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of a Modern Nonprofit podcast. I'm Tosha Anderson, your host, and today we have a very special guest because Alex, you're going to talk to us about money, and you're coming at it from a little bit different angle because Alex Johnston is our guest today. Alex, you are the founder of Building Impact Partners, and you work with philanthropists on
That's
how
right.
to give away money. Okay. And you have actually worked with your clients. Again, for those of you that are listening, perk up your ears a little bit. Alex works with individuals that are looking to give away money. So working with the donor side, and you've actually helped your clients give away over $1 billion since founding your practice back in 2012. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. But before we dive into that, Alex, you took it a step further and you decided to write a book about it. So you wrote a book called Money with Meaning: How to Create Joy and Impact Through Philanthropy. So before we dive into the conversation, I just want to say thank you, Alex, for first coming on this podcast and sharing some of your words of wisdom, but then also helping donors get connected with nonprofit organizations that they feel passionate about and helping the cause. So thank you for all of your work there.
Well, Tasha, thank you for having me on, and so appreciate the platform that you're creating here, helping people connect with resources and ideas that can serve them in their mission. So many of us are passionate about making the world a better place, and it's sometimes counterintuitive, or challenging along the way. And so appreciate the chance to have this conversation and share anything that can be helpful to folks.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying that. I know as somebody that has worked for a nonprofit organization and now I work with many organizations, you get all of the stats and inundated with information. And even a simple Google search now, thankfully, though, shameless, shout out to Google and their AI generated summary of their pages and pages and pages of results. I'm really appreciating that new tool. But you get so much conflicting information on all of these things, and that's one of the reasons why we created this platform, to try to bring some really cool tips, tricks, and hacks to the nonprofit space and help them hopefully solve at least just a little bit of their problems to run a better, hopefully more efficient or simpler organization. But let's kind of dive into a little bit about kind of your intention for writing this book, Money with Meaning. You have been working with donors to give away funds for quite some time. Certainly, you've accumulated a lot of experience. What was kind of the driver for writing this book?
Yeah, well, my partners and I have been at this work of philanthropy advising. I've been at it a dozen years, and since we formed a partnership going back 7-8 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we so often find in our practice is, we hear from donors who are struggling to really feel connected to their giving sometimes. And
Mm-hmm.
very often the challenge that donors are experiencing is like, how can I know that my money is making a real difference on the issues that I care most about? So
Sure.
donors come to us often with that question. And then on the
Mm-hmm.
flip side, because we sit in between donors and grantees, we hear so much from amazing social entrepreneurs who are struggling to raise resources at every level, from
Mm-hmm.
just getting started, seed, all the way up to scaling big organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of strange, but there's a lot of money sitting on the side
Mm.
in this country and in this world. And the statistics are kind of mind-boggling. But if you look at what we call ultra high net worth individuals, people
Okay.
who have $30 million or more in assets, there
Okay.
are 130,000 of those people in the United States. And collectively, they have $15 trillion in wealth.
Wow.
Compare that with the amount of money that's in foundations in this country. And that's between like 1.2 and 1.3 trillion. So it's the amount of individual wealth way, way, way exceeds what is sitting inside foundations. And
Repeat
that's
those stats for me one more time, Alex. I'm a numbers junkie. So what
all
did you
right.
say?
So
170,000 people have how much money?
130,000 ultra high net worth individuals collectively have $15 trillion in wealth.
15 trillion.
Yeah.
Got it.
That is how much is held by individuals.
Sure.
There's only 1.2, maybe 1.3 trillion in
Hmm.
foundations. And so many of us who are raising resources, I ran a nonprofit for years, we're
Hmm.
going to foundations and we're asking the same foundations. And
Right.
as the nonprofit sector grows, the foundations, the amount of money in foundations is not actually keeping pace. And
Sure.
so if we don't figure out how to engage meaningfully with individuals
Hmm.
who are still figuring out how they want to direct their giving, or even how much they want to give in the first place,
Mm.
we just can't sustain the work
Sure.
that we're doing. And I keep hearing from nonprofit leaders who are doing, in many cases, the best work they've ever done, and they're hitting a wall. They are, facing layoffs. They're
Right.
really challenged to sustain what they're doing. And
Hmm.
one of the big reasons for this is because we have not figured out sufficiently the piece around individual fundraising, and
Hmm.
particularly, helping connect with individuals who are in a position to be philanthropic, but are still struggling with, how can I have the impact that I want? And how can I have the feelings of personal fulfillment that will be
Mm.
such that I really lean into my giving?
I am floored by that conversation. And it's interesting from my perspective is, being a CPA and an accountant that has worked in the nonprofit space for 15 years. I have lots of conversations about budgets and where the money's going to come from and putting some strategy around where the focus should be. And I think, as you mentioned, if an organization has a high concentration of, say, like governmental funding, oh, we want to diversify that. We want to do more grant writing. Well, typically the grant writing largely coming from foundation or corporate foundations, essentially. But that was interesting what you said and why I wanted you to repeat it because, like 1 point, whatever you mentioned, trillion is in foundation money, but 17 trillion, right? Isn't that what you said?
15
17,
trillion. So
15
more than 10
trillion,
times the amount that's in
right?
foundations is held by individuals.
Yeah. And oftentimes when I think about or I hear about individual giving, of course, we're talking about the ultra wealthy, and we could probably have a much deeper conversation and just the kind of the average person or maybe somewhere in between the average person and the ultra wealthy. There's quite a bit of money that could be given to philanthropy as well. So that's really an interesting kind of statistic that sticks out to me because I think I hear so many different times an organization, well, if we're not getting a lot of money from individual contributions, the events are taking so much time to
Yeah.
produce. Okay, government funding has too many strings attached, or administratively they're too difficult to administer. So let's go after grant writing. But I had no idea that how much money was available, or maybe arguably not available from foundations. So that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's really why I wrote the book, because I wanted to share with donors who might never hire an advisor a
Mm,
DIY playbook. What are the things you can think about, the moves you can make to gear up your
mm-hmm,
giving, even if you never come to a firm like us and hire an advisor? Because
mm-hmm,
again, if we think about those 130,000 individuals and why it's so important, why they're the role they could potentially play in
mm-hmm.
philanthropy, they haven't in many cases decided what they're going to do. They in many cases have not reflected on how much is enough for me and my family.
Mm,
And without having answered that question, they necessarily haven't actually answered the question of what is available for me to put into flow,
mm-hmm.
to help causes that I care about, in my backyard or around the world. And we're living in a world now that's literally and figuratively on fire. And
Yeah.
um, as we see the concentration of wealth just increasing and increasing, it's just so important for people
Mm-hmm.
who have the means to be philanthropic to engage in kind of their own journey around
Yeah.
understanding what's going to be meaningful for them, where social impact and their own fulfillment come together.
So, Alex, since you have kind of this insider scoop on what's happening in the brains or the lives of the ultra wealthy, help us understand a little bit more about kind of what those common challenges are. Like, why or are the ultra high net worth individuals like not giving, or what are some of the roadblocks? You had mentioned some of these individuals are not even working with advisors, they're not mapping out a plan. Obviously, they're trying to determine how much do I need for myself and for future generations. What are
Yeah.
some of these, like what's going on in their lives or their minds that keeps them maybe from giving or coming up with a plan?
Well, the first thing to say is that, each person is individual. And so
Mm-hmm.
their circumstances are going to be based on their own context. But
Mm-hmm.
there's some important trends or data that I think is pretty surprising that most of us, I certainly hadn't realized until I really looked into it. And one of the
Mm-hmm.
first things to remember is that these ultra high net worth individuals, more than three-quarters of them created their wealth in their own lifetime. And
Mm-hmm.
I think we often have the image of dynastic wealth, that wealth
Mm-hmm.
is passed down from generation to generation. And certainly that happens. But when we're talking about the category of people that are defined in the industry as ultra high net worth, people with
Mm-hmm.
30 million or more, that level of wealth is actually only rarely passed across generations.
Mm-hmm.
So only 7% of people who have 30 million or more got it through an inheritance.
Inheritance. Interesting.
And and
7%.
only
Mm.
7% like became that wealthy simply because they inherited it all.
Mm.
75%, started working or middle class and made
Mm-hmm.
that level of money in their own lifetime. And
Mm.
psychologically, the reason that's so important is one of the primary values, if you grew up working or middle class, and
Mm-hmm.
I think many people will relate to this, something you generally don't do is talk about money.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens when people who have that kind of coded into their own context end up
Mm-hmm.
with that much money? It actually is a whole adjustment. There's a great book called Strangers in Paradise by Dr. Jim Grubman, who's a wealth psychologist, and he uses the metaphor of immigration to help
Mm.
sort of relate to the journey that ultra wealthy people are taking from often a very different family circumstance growing up to the level of wealth they now experience. They've kind of immigrated to a land with different norms and in many cases kind of a different cultural context. And the
Mm.
adjustment that they make to that is really key. And he
Mm.
talks about three ways that people adapt. One being avoidance,
Mm.
where people feel like, hey, you know what? I'm not comfortable with this. I don't want my neighbors to know. I don't even want my kids
Mm-hmm.
to know because I'm worried that it will interfere with, their own drive and the values that got me to this place.
Right.
So I'm going to kind of hold back from talking about this. There's another adaptation, which is like, assimilation, where people just go all in. I'm going to be richer than
Mm-hmm.
rich. I'm spending
Mm-hmm.
money on the private jet and everything else. And I'm going to
Sure.
leave behind, everything that I came from. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not a great way to go either, because obviously, like you often had a very positive context in some ways that helped you get there. And so he
Mm-hmm.
talks about sort of the most functional adjustment is when you can kind of integrate the values that where you came from with the
Mm-hmm.
reality of the level of wealth that you now have and that your circumstances truly are different. And
Interesting.
it's the challenge of making that adjustment that I find to be one of the biggest barriers around philanthropy. Because if people are avoidant, then philanthropy is publicly exposed. And so I see people all the time who actually don't lean into their giving, in part because they don't want their kids to realize, oh, we have
Mm-hmm.
$250 million that it's extra that we're putting in a foundation. Like, how come we never talked about that? Right.
Right. Right.
And so that's just one example of, and then obviously if someone is in that like assimilation mode, they're not even thinking about philanthropy necessarily.
Sure.
They're thinking about how do I sort of demonstrate, and their philanthropy then may be more performative, and that turns a lot of people off because
Mm.
it's oh, you just want to sort of go to the gala or get your name on the
Right.
side of the
Right.
bill.
On the building. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, Alex, I'm a numbers junkie statistics wise, and maybe there aren't statistics on this, but of those kind of three categories of the ultra wealthy, where would you say the majority of these kind of self-made people, where would they fall? Is it more avoidant? Is it more, or is it across the board? Is it is
Well,
it hard to gauge? What would you
I
say
I
in
mean,
your
I don't
experience?
know that there is survey data. I'd be actually interested what Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Grubman would say about that.
Mm-hmm.
But that we do have some indirect evidence, which is that, if we look at the 130,000 people who have $15 trillion,
Mm-hmm.
there are some pretty good estimates of how much of that they're giving away each year. And it only amounts to about 85 to $90 billion, which
Mm-hmm.
is barely half of 1% of that total wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And we also know that probably about 30 to 40% of that 15 trillion is held either in cash or in public securities, which are essentially liquid. So it's there is the sometimes people look at that number and say, oh, well, that's not real. That's all like money that's tied up in private companies and real estate. And
Mhm.
so you can't really treat that as available for philanthropy.
Sure.
But we know that probably at least a third of that 15 trillion truly is just
Could be a
there.
check written
And
tomorrow. Yeah.
yep.
Hmm.
And so when we see how relatively small a portion of that is actually being given away, it does
Mm.
suggest that people who have that level of resource are struggling for whatever reason um, to give relative to their intentions. And we see this very clearly with
Mm.
people who've signed the Giving Pledge. And this is for very wealthy people who are committing to give away at least half their resources within their own lifetime or shortly
Mhm.
thereafter. And the statistics there are stunning, that of the 60 some folks who signed it originally, only 11 have actually like seen their net worth go down as a result of giving.
Mm.
And the vast
Mhm.
majority are just so successful. Their businesses are still growing that even though some of them are topping the Forbes list of giving every year, giving away more than
Wow.
$1 billion a year, their wealth is just growing much faster.
Continuing to grow.
And
Wow.
so there really is, a challenge in for people certainly at the billionaire level in keeping up with their growth and wealth in terms of their giving.
It's so fascinating to me to hear these statistics because, according to my TikTok and Instagram, when you think of the ultra wealthy, you think of, the old money and the images of, being in the Hamptons and like, all this generational wealth. But, the statistics are surprising to me, but really, being in the financial and accounting space myself, I also understand statistics about how many ultra wealthy people or the average millionaire is certainly self-made. And some of the things that you were talking about coming from like a working class or like, if nothing else, like middle class background, not growing up with all of this surplus and all of these privileges, it wouldn't really surprise me that people are avoidant in talking about it, avoidant in sharing with their children, avoidant in making specific plans around giving, because if you're just not talking about it or acknowledging it and you continue to live your like normal, under the radar life, you're certainly not having conversations with the children's hospital and putting your name on the side of the building, right?
Yeah.
Probably for the average person. So that wouldn't surprise me at all. That's interesting.
Yeah.
In good context. And I guess it kind of brings me back to, if I were a fundraiser, really kind of shifting my mindset on, making sure to make those asks to network. And the people that you're probably least expecting probably have more opportunity to give. And there's so many statistics out there that suggest that people give when asked and when you're not asking or you're not, being forthcoming with what your organization needs and how somebody can support you, how much money is left on the sidelines, as you call it. So kind of
Yeah,
interesting
I
stuff
think
to think about.
there is certainly a good rule of thumb in fundraising, which is never assume that someone's capacity to give is based on what they've done previously, because
Hmm.
there is so much money sitting on the sidelines that you really don't know. And I just heard a story from someone the other day who is a major gifts officer at a
Hmm.
university, and they were talking about how they had a donor who routinely gave maybe $25,000-$50,000 a year, so that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, in the middle of the pandemic, this was a donor who gave millions, and it
Wow.
far exceeded what the institution knew about their wealth level. Even no
Interesting.
matter how sophisticated the tools are
Yeah.
that you think you have, you just don't know a lot of times
Hmm.
because people's finances are complex. And
Hmm.
uh, so I think it's a good rule of thumb not to assume. But I want to touch on something you said too about the role of asking in fundraising, and
Hmm.
and I think that this is a little counterintuitive and maybe controversial, but
Hmm.
we have this whole webinar series called Fully Human Fundraising, where I've so many grantees and others are contacting me because in the last year or so it has been getting tougher out there for
Hmm.
nonprofits raising resources. As
Yeah.
we see public dollars from the stimulus drying up,
Yeah.
we've got a lot of nonprofits out there that are doing the best work they've ever done, and they're hitting a wall. And
Hmm.
yeah, I'm very concerned about it. And I think
Yeah.
I imagine a lot of your listeners may be experiencing this too.
Yeah.
And so I've really been reflecting on how is it that nonprofit leaders and fundraisers can better connect with ultra high net worth individuals. Again, because so many leaders feel like, hey, I don't have these people in my Rolodex. I look in
Right.
myself contacts. I don't think I have, all these ultra millionaires sitting there just waiting for me to give them a call. And I think there's this idea in fundraising that sort of an industry norm that, we've got a funnel and we've got to get, people in the top of our funnel. We've got to work the steps of the process and somehow
Mhm.
out the bottom come our donors. And that
Mm.
it's a volume game and we need to always be out there asking. And,
Mhm.
if that's working for people, that's great.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting that people stop doing something that's working. But
Mhm.
what I am seeing, and I know in my own experience, is that sometimes a single relationship can end up being absolutely transformative, particularly if
Mm.
you're talking about people who have tremendous capacity to give. Like
Mhm.
the example of, say, Jeffrey Canada and Stanley Druckenmiller. So Jeffrey Canada runs the Harlem Children's Zone. Stanley Druckenmiller was actually a college classmate of Jeffrey Canada, but they
Mhm.
never met when they were in college. Years
Mm.
later, they're in New York. Jeffrey started up the Harlem Children's Zone, and somehow he gets connected with Stanley Druckenmiller,
Mhm.
and they just hit it off. And over the years, Stanley Druckenmiller now, he's in finance. He's probably given hundreds of millions of dollars to the Harlem
Wow.
Children's Zone, ended up as the board chair. And that one single relationship has, I mean, as they both share about it, like it's been transformative for them at a
Mm.
personal level and a level of
Mm.
meaning. And it really was so pivotal in the whole arc of that organization. And and that didn't come, from sort of this like forcing people through a funnel and
Mm.
feeling like you have to make an ask all the time. And so I think that when we actually think about what major gift officers do, these are the people who raise the largest gifts in the country every year,
Mhm. Mhm.
hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's so relational. They are not actually under the illusion that the only thing that matters to ultra high net worth individuals is social impact. And I know this
Right.
is going to be kind of like we feel weird in saying this, but
Yeah,
ultra high net worth people are full human beings. They have a
they
whole
are.
wide range of motivations. And yes, if you're in a conversation with them about philanthropy, they do care about social impact. But there's a lot
Mhm.
of other psychological needs that come to bear. And
Mm.
it's a little bit against the current in our culture to sort of center the feelings of ultra high net worth individuals. I mean, people are like, come on, you just got to give, and we have a whole program we're running really around shaming people into giving more,
Mm.
but it's
Mm.
not working. Um,
Right.
and I think we know from our own lives that shame is actually not a good motivator. Uh, and the other thing that we try as a society to do is pass regulations and laws. And, I think a lot of us understandably are concerned about this concentration of wealth.
Mhm.
But if I look at the state of our politics in the United States right now, the prospect of radically changing tax laws or requirements for, distributions from donor advised funds, these bills are stuck in Congress. They're not going
Mhm.
anywhere anytime
Right.
soon.
Yeah.
So really actually focusing on personal connection and motivation on the part of ultra high net worth people and how you as an individual raising resources can better connect, I think is absolutely pivotal. And we can talk more about that, but uh,
Yeah.
a lot of what people are doing, I think, is actually going against better connection and
Mhm.
trust, because when you try to sell and you just get people's attention any way you can and then you
Mhm.
immediately ask, that is not actually building connection, because one of the things I know that so many ultra high net worth people are concerned about is that the only thing people value them for is their money.
Mm.
And
Mm.
that's a sort of a deep seated concern they have.
Sure.
And unfortunately, fundraising tactics often reinforce that perception, even if it's not
Mm.
the case. Um, they often come away from pitches feeling like they're not being fully recognized.
Interesting. I could have a whole separate conversation about that, but I know we want to talk about other things. But one of the things that my brain is going to as you're saying all of this, I've sat in so many conversations with nonprofit leaders, including their fundraising team, and they talk often about we don't have a big donor list. We need a bigger donor list. And when you talk about this concept of a funnel, that's a lot of times what I hear. We have events to bring more people and to donate sometimes larger, but oftentimes smaller dollar amounts, right? And it's more a volume game. And it's interesting because I couldn't even begin to tell you how many fundraising events. And I don't know if I've ever had a single organization reach out to me and try to develop a sort of relationship with me in any way other than the obligatory like donor thank you letter.
Yeah.
But through the volumes game, it's just it makes me think rather than going wider, you kind of go deeper with the fewer people that you have. And is that I think like you said, it's a different take on how to approach philanthropy. And I just speak from also my own experience. Like I said, I've been to so many different events, and I don't know if I've had a single like organization ever try to reach out, invite me to come see their space, or whatever it is, right? Really to start building that relationship, because it is a volume game and it is a numbers game. And if we just fill the top of the funnel, shake everything out, those individuals that are motivated to give higher gifts will maybe naturally rise to the surface. But and that's probably true to some degree, but to your point, and I think the point of this whole conversation, how many individuals are within that mix that are really low key about their ability to give, and because of the way philanthropy is designed, it's just never going to be known. They're never going to
Yeah.
get asked. So you bring up some really interesting things to kind of think about. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I
So
think, oh, so go ahead.
no, I wanted to talk a little bit more about this idea of this like fully human fundraising, and really talking about what that looks like with these ultra high net wealth people, kind of understanding how do you ask, or how do you kind of lean into this fully human fundraising piece.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, I think I so appreciate the point you just made about how so much in the fundraising world really is a volume game. And
Hmm.
that makes sense to a degree when the
Right.
capacity of the people you're engaging is relatively speaking not that high. And the amount of
Hmm.
time that a nonprofit can afford to spend with someone who's going to give them $100,
Sure.
is very, very low. But if we're talking about someone who might give you $1 million, it's a very
Hmm.
different calculation. And the
Hmm.
problem that a lot of nonprofits have is they don't think they know anyone who could give them 1 million. And they
Hmm.
also
Hmm.
aren't sure how to tell if somebody has that level of capacity.
Right.
Because unless someone is a billionaire and their name shows up on the Forbes list,
Right.
most of the folks who are ultra high net worth are not household names. And unless you
Right.
have really sophisticated research, you just might not know.
Right.
Um, and so I think the thing that I think about in the core practice of fully human fundraising is what we call a powerful conversations campaign.
Hmm.
And and this is really about understanding that when you are sharing passionately and authentically about the change you want to make in the world and the challenges that lie in front of you, um, it's equally important that you ask the same question of the people you're meeting with, no matter who they are. Because
Hmm.
if you're going to be spending your time meeting with people, um,
Hmm.
the idea, like some people don't have this as part of their fundraising, like they just don't do one-on-one meetings. But I really think it's a great practice because you can network your way to people who have the capacity to give meaningfully, including non-financially. There are people out there who have political capital, social capital, cultural
Hmm.
capital,
Hmm.
physical capital, like buildings, or
Yeah.
things that could be incredibly useful to your mission. And so
Mhm.
thinking expansively. So I think I would shift from like what you might call the transactional treadmill, where you get
Mm.
people's attention and then you immediately ask, right? And whether that's through direct mail or a meeting or whatever. That is off-putting to a lot of donors because you're missing a critical step in the middle, which is relevance to the donor. And
Mhm.
so I think about an arc. You get attention through multiple ways, you demonstrate relevance and value through multiple possibilities. And then the C in ARC, ARC, is contribution. You actually, instead of making an ask, you offer multiple pathways by which
Mhm.
people can contribute meaningfully to your organization,
Mhm.
including not giving money.
Right.
Even if you know that money is the thing that's like most short in supply, a lot of times when people can connect and give something non-financial, it then becomes so it flows so much more for them to give financially, especially.
Mm.
And so that again, that's where people realize, oh, I really feel connected to this organization now. And now, oh, there's a need financially. Okay, now I feel
Sure.
really differently about really going deep. And so there's a lot more than we could get into right now. But we have a whole, I think right now we're up to 8 segments in this series that walks people through this methodology for how you do a powerful conversations campaign, and
Mm-hmm.
kind of how you show up in a different way. And even if you don't think there are any ultra high net worth people immediately in your world, if there are people in your donor list who you think may have more capacity than what they're giving right now, that's a great place to start.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is probably something someone can debate with me about, but I've always been of the mindset, if someone's able to write you a substantial check, and let's, pivot away temporarily from the ultra
Sure.
wealthy, but even just the average, millionaire, let's say, if someone's writing you a $5,000 check or a $10,000 check, unless it is a settlement of an estate or something significant that kind of where the source of this funding is coming from, right? But it's just kind of out of the blue, a $5,000 check, or somebody that's barely been introduced to your organization, one-time gala, they come in hot with, a fund in need, and you don't show record of them ever participating. That is not their highest and best ability to contribute, right? And so it's always been surprising to me, organizations that don't immediately develop relationships with these individuals, and just, not even asking them for anything, just asking them what, how they get introduced to your organization and what made them give. Or to kind of flip a little bit on the other side, if you show records of an individual diligently and religiously giving your organization $100 every single year in December, as a year-end gift, and they've been doing the same gift for 10 years in a row, they're committed to your organization.
Yeah.
And just because they give you $100 doesn't mean they don't have the capacity to give you $100,000, or that's someone that's obviously invested in your organization and have been following you for quite some time, and probably not had a lot of donor cultivation because they've only given $100 a year. But that's probably a perfect planned giving opportunity, and you would never know unless you kind of follow the data and really track what the donor activity is happening. So what you were saying, and certainly with the ultra wealthy, but I would say even the average donor, let's not kind of assume, which I think a lot of people do, that whatever they gave is what the maximum that they're comfortable giving.
Yeah.
And I really love your point about offering options that are not necessarily financial, going back to the ultra wealthy. If the concern is that their fear or insecurity or concern that the only reason people are interested in having a relationship with them, or partnering them within any way, is simply because of their money, by offering a non-monetary option to get involved with the organization, I think creates that level of trust there, or at least starts to build that bridge that might eventually, convert to financial gifts eventually. So I love that idea.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most corrosive things for trust is when you appear to be self-oriented.
Mm,
And and so when you're only asking for one form of support, that it's hard for the donor not to feel like the story is about you and not about them.
mhm,
And or
mhm,
that there isn't as much space for them in the story of what your organization is doing. And I
mhm,
really get, having run a nonprofit and sort of the imperative of making payroll. I'm not saying
mhm.
to folks like, don't ask for money. I mean, we need money. And sometimes the thing that
Sure.
is most transformative for us is no strings attached general operating support. And so that's a reality. And I
Mhm,
just encourage folks to think creatively about how a donor can meet more of their own human needs in
mhm,
the process of giving. And very often that involves, you know, bringing other parts of their selves to bear. And, you might have
mhm,
donors who've been chefs, right? And like,
mhm,
you can host a dinner where they get to, do their art, in some
mhm,
sense, or just something that they find engaging,
mhm,
that's sort of a wrinkle. And so the more creative you get with that, the more you tap into someone's full humanity.
mhm,
And we all, are ultimately looking to actualize our best selves. And when there's an opportunity to do that in relationship with your organization, it can be deeply meaningful for the
mhm.
donors that you're working with.
That's um that gives a lot to think about, especially from like the fundraising perspective and us asking for more money. But I kind of want to just wrap things up a little bit, going back to kind of, the purpose of also the book is going back from more of like the donor lens, and how can you as a donor, for those that are listening, or even just give us a glimpse into the mindset of what donors might be thinking about, how can they show up or start engaging in kind of their own giving, to make sure that it's like meaningful, impactful for them, and kind of bring them joy. What should some of the things that people should be thinking about if they're considering giving, or on the flip side, if you're somebody that's engaging with these individuals, that you
Yeah.
might be considering, when meeting
Yeah.
these folks?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And the book really is written as a DIY guide for donors
Yeah.
and also the advisors who work with them. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a part of the book that walks through design fundamentals for meaningful giving. We call them the 10
Mm-hmm.
W's, the what, why, where, when, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that in my work as an advisor can be a great place to help donors get started. So if you are a donor or you're an advisor working with a donor, there's just a series of reflection exercises,
Mm-hmm.
they're worksheets, but they can also just be organic questions that you ask
Mm-hmm.
yourself. And when you sit with a quality question about the why behind your giving or the
Mm-hmm.
where or the when, you're really giving yourself an opportunity to connect the impact that you have out in the world with your own personal fulfillment. And that is so important.
Mm-hmm.
We really need to give ourselves as donors, whatever level we're giving at, permission
Mm-hmm.
to explore our own feelings, emotions, and sense of satisfaction. Because if
Mm-hmm.
giving ends up feeling like a spiritless chore, the reality
Mm-hmm.
is it's optional and we will do less of it.
Mm-hmm.
And, on the other hand, if you fall into the trap of kind of selfish giving, where it's sort of like a purchase disguised as philanthropy,
Yeah.
ultimately you'll keep chasing fulfillment that won't actually be satisfying in
Mm-hmm.
the long run for many people. And then there's also the risk that people just give up. They fall into what we call senseless giving, where they're neither having
Mm-hmm.
impact nor any sense of fulfillment. They're like maybe on that circuit of endless charity galas that don't feel meaningful to them. And so
Yeah.
the biggest thing is just taking a quick pause and reflecting a little bit and just bringing that level of intentionality. You don't have to make giving something you go pro and spend all your time on, but
Mm-hmm.
an hour a month of reflection connected
Yeah.
to just one specific action can really be a great way to get yourself in motion.
Alex, this is like some advice that I had heard years ago, and I know this conversation is geared towards, certainly people that have lots and lots of resources, but I heard this advice which kind of echoes what you're saying, but this applies, I think, for all people, regardless of their giving levels, whether whatever their giving level is now, what it's going to be in the future, is to consider what causes are you really passionate about, and really kind of defining your giving principles. I'm kind of paraphrasing this. I don't even know where it came from, but kind of defining like what causes are you most passionate about that you're going to give the best, and greatest like impact with your giving, your time, your energy, whatever it might be, and accept that it's okay that you're not uber passionate about every single thing. And so really kind of narrowing down and having that conversation with yourself. What matters most to me? How do I want to give back? What does that look like? So that when you are approached with opportunities, you can feel confident in saying, while I really, respect that, or, I can understand the need here, but this is what I am choosing to support at this time. Foundations have this, government has this, different priority areas. And I really, anybody listening that is any level of donor, and so many of us are, whether regardless of kind of the scale in which we're able to do that, really kind of think about what matters most to you. I think all donors should be having those conversations with themselves, because to your point, when I don't remember the phrase that you used, but almost just kind of this like mindless kind of obligatory invitations to all of these events, or if your philanthropy is simply just rounding up at the cash register,
Yeah.
or hey, your friend asked you to give to this but you don't really know anything about it, so you're like, sure. If you're interested in making an impact with your money, or with your giving, or even with your time or energy, think about what those causes are most important to you. And that's a harder exercise than you realize, especially if you're kind of a social impact junkie like myself. It's really hard to narrow down because there's so many great causes. But if you really want to make it meaningful, you I think you really have to kind of narrow it down. And as a numbers person, how can you go deeper with an organization in that relationship, whether it's financially or otherwise, rather than kind of spreading yourself so thin. The great thing is there's so many causes out there and there's so many people and there's going to be matches across the board. But I think as everybody tries to kind of sprinkle a little bit here and there, it's not going to give us that fulfillment and joy that I think we're looking for. So
Yeah, I certainly agree that getting more clarity about the what, which causes you're most interested in is important. And also, sometimes the experience you want to have in your giving is also important because, especially, if you know that the issue you care about is climate, and no matter what level of resource you have, even if you are Jeff Bezos, your resources alone are insufficient to address that challenge.
Right.
And so people sometimes get stuck thinking, well, I can't transform this issue and my little bit of money isn't really going to make the difference. And there it's then about, well, okay, I want to give to a cause I care about, but I also want the experience of giving to be meaningful to me. And maybe that's backing an amazing entrepreneur that you really feel connected to. Maybe it's giving in a community that's really important to you. There are other factors that can contribute to your sense of purpose and meaning, and have it really connect for you personally.
I love that. Alex, this has been such a cool conversation. I've really appreciated all of the insight. And just to recap for everybody that's listening, Alex's book is Money with Meaning. I think this would be an awesome read. Here, I'll show up on the camera. Money with Meaning. It's such an awesome read, I think, for anybody in the philanthropy space, whether you're a donor listening that, I haven't really done any of this homework or mental exercises. It's a great DIY manual to kind of start having that conversation with yourself. But also if you're in philanthropy and you want to better understand the humanizing of this fundraising that we're talking about, this is certainly a great read for that. But Alex, anyone else that's listening and wanted to connect with you one-on-one, what would be the best way to just get in touch with you, connect with you?
Well, our business website, buildingimpactpartners.com, you can contact me through that. And then if you're interested in the book or all this material we've been talking about, meaningfulgiving.co is the place where that book lives and lots of other resources. We have a free playbook that goes, you don't even need to buy the book. You can get a digital playbook that walks through all the content chapter by chapter if you choose. So you can find that at meaningfulgiving.co.
Awesome. Well, again, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. This has been such, I think, an informative and interesting conversation. And for everybody listening, shameless plug for me, you know how this works. Please engage with this content in some way. As we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we started creating content like this just to make sure that it's searchable and available for nonprofit leaders like yourself. And you know how the social media works. The more that you engage and interact, whether it's like, share, subscribe, whatever it might be, we'll make it more searchable for other leaders of nonprofits like yourself that needs resources like this. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye. That's all we have for you today. Once again, I'm Tosha Anderson with the Charity CFO, and this is A Modern Nonprofit Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to A Modern Nonprofit Podcast on all major streaming platforms so you will stay notified for when the latest episode drops, which will help you stay in the know about anything nonprofit related. Also, join our community on Facebook by searching for A Modern Nonprofit Podcast and follow us on all of our social media accounts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.